para todo el
Sí,
mundo.
está perfecto que
Entienden
hables en inglés.
todos.
Todos
Okay.
perfectamente. Entonces, entonces sí, pues yo pienso
Yo
que
puedo tomar las preguntas en español, pero bueno, yo trabajé en francés, pero inglés es más fácil para mí.
perfecto. Sí, Annie, no, entonces podemos hacer eso, podemos hacer una mezcla como vaya saliendo, de eso se trata. La
Y
idea
si
es
todo el
que,
mundo habla francés, yo lo puedo hacer en francés, aún más fácil para mí.
perfecto, también puede ser, también pueden salir palabras en francés, así queda elegantísimo el seminario. Pero no, Ani, pues de verdad, muchísimas gracias por haber aceptado la invitación. Estamos súper contentos de que estés con nosotros. Yo, como te digo, pues yo hoy no trabajo, yo simplemente estoy aquí para seguir aprendiendo cosas, tanto de ti como
Bueno, no me
de
pueden
mis estudiantes.
pelear porque estoy lejos.
Pueden refutar, obviamente, de
Pueden
eso se trata.
desagradecer, pero no me pueden golpear.
No, tanto así no, de eso no se
Perfecto.
trata. Entonces, Daniela, Laura y Fonseca tienen la palabra para toda la organización. Muchísimas gracias nuevamente, Ani, por aceptar la invitación y súper bienvenida siempre a Bogotá y a la Universidad de los Andes. Entonces, Daniela, Laura y Mariana, el micrófono es de ustedes.
Gracias, Erich. Bueno, Annie, primero que todo, darte las gracias también por estar aquí acompañándonos hoy. Nos emociona porque sabemos que vamos a aprender mucho de ti. Según entiendo, quieres que hagamos las preguntas en español, ¿cierto? O sea, hacemos la sesión en español.
¿Cómo quieren? Yo entiendo, bueno, se me olvidó mucho mi español, pero entiendo las preguntas. Y
Vale,
si
igual.
no las entiendo, yo puedo decir, bueno, dígale de nuevo en inglés.
Listo,
O sea,
perfecto.
¿cómo quieren? ¿Cómo quieren?
Cualquier cosa, tenemos las preguntas en español y en inglés, entonces si hay algo que no entiendes, nos avisas pues para decirte. Queríamos comenzar pues con una pequeña presentación tuya, pues para que los demás estudiantes puedan saber un poco más de ti. Entonces, bueno, Annie es profesora universitaria de Economía en la Universidad de París Panthéon-Sorbonne e investigadora asociada de la Cátedra de Ética y Finanzas y del Centro de Economía de la Sorbonne también. Es miembro de la Junta Directiva de la Asociación Francesa de Ciencias Económicas y de la Junta de la Asociación Internacional Valras y es miembro del Consejo Científico del Instituto de Altos Estudios por la Ciencia y la Tecnología. Ha sido profesora desde hace mucho tiempo, como desde los 80s, y pues también, digamos, ha tenido otros cargos como la vicepresidencia, la presidencia y la junta directiva en la asociación de Charles Kidd para el estudio del pensamiento económico y ha estado en el comité de la dirección de la Asociación Francesa de Ciencias Económicas y ha sido también miembro del Comité Ejecutivo de la Sociedad Europea para el Pensamiento Histórico. Entonces, bueno, para continuar, queremos hacerte entonces la primera pregunta, que sería, ¿qué ha significado para ti ser mujer a lo largo de tu carrera?
Bueno, no, sorry, in English, it's better. I think maybe less in your generation, but in my generation, it was slightly more difficult. The idea was that you were not allowed any type of mistake. And it was even the double difficult because I chose to work in a field, history of economic theories, which was not the mainstream in economics, like it's not the mainstream today, whether in Los Andes or in La Nacional. So the only thing is that you had to work hard and to be accepted and behave, which means you had a sort of an incentive, but it was not unpleasant. I always loved to be a woman, and I would not have liked to be a boy. So I was happy with that, but it's true that it was definitely a man's world. When I became full professor, I arrived in Lille, which is a city north of Paris, near Belgium. And on 160 professors, assistant professor, researchers, and all that. There was only 2 associate professor women. I was the 3rd one. And it was extremely strange, which means that in the meetings, there were only boys. It was strange. It was like that. And it was strange for them, and it was strange for me. So, but it was not uneasy. It was like that. And it's so much more fun to be a woman than to be a man, that the price was okay. So I think it has changed. There are more women in the profession now, still with a glass ceiling, which means that there are more associate professors. I think we are still like 20% full professors in the profession, which is not very much, but we were like 10% when I became full professor. That's like that. It's changing, it's moving. And I think, curiously, the mathematics helped, which means that a lot of women became full professor because they were trained as engineers, or they were trained with a high level of mathematics, and hence they were good at modeling and econometrics and all that sort of things. And they were very good. So they did publish and they became full professor. So strangely, it was through the mainstream, very highly mathematical economics that women, for one generation, that women could become full professor.
Yo quería decir una cosita y es, no sé si me apresuré un poquito con la primera pregunta, pero no sé si nos quieras contar algo más de tu vida que yo no haya mencionado. No sé, alguna época importante en tu vida, o sí que te haya marcado, o sé que ha sido ser profesora. O...
No, toda la vida es divertida y maravillosa. No, la única cosa es que para mi generación, ¿se dice generación, Erich? Generation. For my generation, sorry, that's better in English. For my generation, the idea was not to mention anything about your personal life, which means that, for instance, in 4 years, I had 1 child. Then I passed this agrégation, which is a competition that allows in France to become full professor. And it's a competition every 2 years. And there is 0, 1 or 2 women each time on 20 or 20, yes, more or less on 20 professors. So the number of women. So I had a child, I passed the agrégation, I had another one. And the idea was that I had to act as if this did not exist, which means that there is no babysitting and there is no school and there is no, you manage for your own life, which in a way is not, I know it's not in fashion anymore, but it's not unpleasant. It's not unpleasant being in a man's world. It's not unpleasant to act like a man. But this was a former generation of feminism, which was, the idea was to be accepted with lipstick, of course, with being a woman, not disguised as a man, which was I had 2 or 3 women professors at the university who definitely resembled men. I mean, they had eradicated every sign of women, like they look like men. And in my generation, I had my curls, I had lipsticks, and I had high heels, and I definitely did not resemble a boy. But the idea was to be accepted as a professor, as a neutral professor. So I think that was, maybe it's different today. I'm not sure it's entirely different. It's different for the students. It is not entirely different for professors. I mean, if you want to be accepted in this world, you have to you have to be as good as a man. And being as good as a man means that if you have a meeting scheduled at 6 o'clock at night, you manage to be there at 6 o'clock at night, even if you have 2 little boys waiting for you at home. So I don't know, you take them. Well, yes, I can tell you one story. I had a meeting from the Association Charles Gide that you mentioned, which I had a meeting in a library in the university, which was on Saturday morning, and I tried everything, and I was alone with the two boys, and so I had to take them. It was the only, I didn't find any type of babysitting, whatever. So I took them with me, and they were like 4 and 7, something like that. So I had paper, and I had, how do you say, des feutres? Comment tu dis des feutres, Erich? You'll be my favorite translator. Well, anyway, things to draw. And how do you say, the markers? How do you call that?
Sí, sí, marcadores.
Marcadores de color. And I left them in one room, and I had the meeting, and they were wonderful. They were silent. 1 week after, so I was very proud of them. It was just, they disappeared. 1 week after, I go to borrow a book, and at that time, you had those files in boxes. You had a wooden sort of a little library with all those fiches. Comment se dit in fiches in English? Les fiches. Anyway, it was like paper, and you had the number of the book and all that. So I go and borrow a book, and one of the librarians comes saying, "You have little boys, don't you?" I said, "Yes." She knew, and said, "Did you have a meeting last Saturday?" I say, "How do you know?" And she says, "Open anything," and they had put drawing on all the files of the books. So from time to time, you cannot avoid being a girl and having little children. It's not the type of story you wanted, but it's the type of story I'm giving you.
Yo puedo hacer una pregunta con respecto a lo que estaba diciendo Annie hace un momento, que me parece, no sé qué piensas tú, Annie, pero creo que esto que contabas tú de esta separación, esta diferenciación entre la esfera académica y la esfera privada, digamos, donde todo tiene que estar separado, puede ser algo un poco muy francés. Yo creo que en este curso hace unas semanas hablábamos de algo que a mí me impactó mucho cuando llegué a Francia en el 2010, 2011, que fue este escándalo que hubo con Dominique Strauss-Kahn.
Sí.
Justamente cuando pues Dominique Strauss-Kahn, para los que no lo recuerdan, era un candidato presidencial un poco de la izquierda, digamos, más o menos francesa, que se supone que pues iba a ganarse las siguientes elecciones contra Sarkozy, ¿cierto, Dani? Me parece que era. Obviamente él había sido muy importante director del Fondo Monetario Internacional, y estando en Nueva York lo acusaron, pero no era la primera acusación, pero tuvo una acusación muy importante de acoso sexual y de abuso sexual y de violación contra una empleada de un hotel en donde estaba en Nueva York. Y yo me acuerdo que el debate, lo que a mí me sorprendió muchísimo en Francia, era algo así como las cosas que pasan, digamos, en la vida personal de una figura pública como Dominique Strauss-Kahn son problema de su vida privada. No necesariamente eso debería influir en lo que pase dentro de la campaña presidencial, y el discurso era un poco, es un poco complot de parte de la derecha por que Strauss-Kahn no gane las elecciones, ¿cierto? Entonces era como, en Francia a nosotros no nos importa mucho, por lo menos en esa época era lo que me acuerdo decían algunos de mis compañeros, no nos importa mucho la vida privada, lo que nos importan son los programas, las ideas, los debates de los candidatos. Entonces mi pregunta era un poco como, ¿tú ves que eso ha cambiado un poco tanto en la esfera, digamos, política como en la esfera social? Y de pronto ya lo mencionaste un poquito en la disciplina económica, ¿cierto? Que tú dices de pronto eso en la disciplina no ha cambiado tanto, pero entonces quería saber cómo ves tú eso, si de pronto sí hay un movimiento, digamos, como social en ese sentido y político, que hoy en día eso sí que importaría mucho, y pues de hecho importó porque pues Strauss-Kahn no pudo presentarse a las elecciones y obviamente Sarkozy fue reelegido, etc. Pero quisiera saber si de pronto esos movimientos desde lo político, desde lo social, con todo lo que ha pasado con el Me Too, que en Francia se llamaba Balance Ton Port y no sé qué más cosas, ¿cierto? No sé si eso tiene algunas repercusiones sobre la academia en general en Francia y en particular sobre la disciplina económica.
Sí, pienso que todo ha cambiado muchísimo en ese sentido, desde el Me Too y bueno, con un movimiento general. Pienso que cuando yo estaba estudiante había profesores que asaltaban a estudiantes female, sorry, in English. There were professors who sort of harassed some female students. And this is not possible anymore. Everybody will know. So no, things have changed a lot. There was a scandal recently with the head of the Foundation for Political Science, who is a well-known man, professor of political science and public law, and who 25 or 30 years ago had an affair with his stepson, the son of his wife, from a former marriage. And there was a book written by the sister of this young man, and there was a huge scandal on the incest. How do you say incest? Incesto, se dice?
Incesto,
and
sí.
There was a huge scandal on that, and he's totally banished from everywhere. And there is a new Me Too for incest. No. This is moving very fast. It's not exactly what I was saying. What I was saying is that there is a sort, and this is going to be part of what I shall discuss today. The feminism of my generation was a feminism which was non-essentialist. In other words, if you were a woman, you were a woman in your private life, with your friends, with your lovers, with whoever. But in the university, you were a professor, whether you were a man or a woman. And so there was no essence. Of course, it is different, but there was no essence of being a woman in your professional life. And that was not heavy. No, it wasn't. It was just that you arrived at a status. The only thing is that some men allowed themselves to have practices which would have been, I had some friends who were very shocked by those sexual harassment and things like that, and they were men. So it's a matter of ethics and morals, and it's not a matter of gender. Even if sexual harassment in the university is usually made by men, not by women. But what I'm saying is that there is one of the big debate today in France, at least, is on essence. But France has this tradition since the French Revolution, which was at the end of the 18th century, has this tradition which is as citizens or as professionals, no matter your gender, no matter your origin, no matter your religion, no matter the color of your skin, you are a citizen. And this is very specific among the European Union. Great Britain, which is not in the European Union, but part of Europe. Great Britain doesn't have this, and a lot of countries don't have this. But this idea that regarding your citizenship, your relationship with other citizens, your relationship to the state, in law, in principle, doesn't mean that everybody is equal. Absolutely not. But from a legal perspective, or a political perspective, or a foundational perspective, everybody is equal. And this meant that during the French Revolution, people who were Jewish or Protestant as religions They didn't have the same right than the Catholics, and they began to have the same rights. So the idea, of course, it doesn't work always, because the women were not allowed to vote until World War II, the end of World War II. But what I'm saying is that you have this deep, and this explains a little bit what Erich was saying. You have this idea that private life and professional life should be separate. Okay. But we are far from our subject.
Ok, bueno, gracias por esa explicación, y creo que pues la siguiente pregunta que teníamos es un poquito relacionado a esto que estabas diciendo y cómo eso ha cambiado, digamos, durante el tiempo, y es, digamos, ¿qué dirías que ha sido como un vínculo entre la historia y la economía? O como el género y la economía, y cómo esto ha ido cambiando también a lo largo de la historia, y cómo, digamos, esa economía y el género y la noción que se ha tenido de eso, pues ha ido cambiando.
Well, I'm from the generation which began, even before I finished my PhD, which began to work on women in economics. It was not from a historical perspective, although I remember I was interviewed in a newspaper, I don't remember which, and I was asked, so as an academic, as a future academic, how could you consider the problem of gender in social sciences? And my answer was through history already, it is by going through the evolution of the situation of women in market societies or Occidental societies or whatever. I mean, what we were speaking about, that you can understand some things about the current situation. But one of the first, maybe not the first, my first article was on a criticism of Becker and Gary Becker and all those neoliberals of the time. And I think the second, but with other people, we wrote on the status of domestic labor, but putting it as a theoretical question, which is, what do you do with a non-market commodity or a non-market production? So how do you analyze this? How do you take it into account? And so we browsed from the Marxist position, the radical feminist position and all that. So since the very beginning, some, well, not many, but some academics already begun to take as a theoretical object or an epistemological object this idea that in modern societies, part of the work was missing, was not visible and was unseen and did not exist but this was also linked to what happened in South America at the time, which was the theory of duality in matter of development, where you had a formal sector and an informal sector. So we also use this, trying to think about domestic labor as a form of informal sector in Europe or in the States. I don't know if this answers the question. Sí, no.
Yes, perfect. Thank you, Annie. Bueno, en español, en relación con lo que estabas diciendo, pues que es muy interesante, también queríamos como complementarlo con la siguiente pregunta, que es, ¿cuál crees que ha sido el papel que han tenido las mujeres en la historia de la economía? ¿Y cómo crees que se ha visto, pues, para, por ejemplo, en tu profesión, pues como profesora, y pues sí?
Creo que necesito una traducción. ¿Qué quiere decir el papel?
Like the role?
The role, could you try to repeat the question in English or in French? In English?
The question in English would be, what role do you think women have played in the history of economics?
Oh, this is one of the things I wanted to present later, which is, well, there are many roles. One role is to participate, but they couldn't do it. They did translate since the 18th century for the women who had the education for that. Quite a lot of women did translate. Well, you have Sophie de Grouchy, for instance, who translated the theory of moral, Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments into French. The 19th century more and more, and in the 19th century, translators began to translate in such a way that they wrote their own books. So the interpretation was huge. At the point that, I don't know if you know who Auguste Comte, who is not an economist, but a sociologist and philosopher, was translated into English by a woman. And then he read the translation and he said, oh, this book is great, you should translate it back into French. So the book was very different. It was around his work, but very different. So you had translators, and little by little, you began to have authors, but this took quite a lot of time. It's only in the early 20th century. I'll come back to this in my preliminary remarks. It's only in the early 20th century that women were authorized themselves. I mean, the construction allowed the social construction of what an academic in economics was, allowed them to write their own work. And strangely enough, it was Rosa Luxemburg, who was a Marxist, also German social democrat, who was the first one to write The Accumulation of Capital. I think it was 1913. So it's only at the 19th century, but the 19th century was a terrible century in Europe, was a terrible century for women. It was dominated by the church. It was dominated by this very strong industrialization. And it was the 18th century for some categories of population, for the peasants, for the aristocracy. The 18th century was much more, how do you say that? Easy with women. Women had the right to own land and to own a house. And in the 19th century closed everything. And the religion helped a lot on that. I mean, the religion was terrible in the 19th century for the situation of women. So it's little by, but there is a spectrum of reason. You don't have one reason. Among the reason, you had the lack of education. You had the idea that women were not allowed to divorce, that when they were not married, when they had children, they had to become a prostitute because they were thrown away from their family. You had a lot of reasons. When they worked, they had terrible conditions compared to men. They didn't have trade unions. I mean, we'll discuss all that, but there was a lot of extremely difficult social situations. So there is a spectrum of reasons, but I think that what really, I mean, you have this movement growing in the 20th century, and this led to to my opinion, one of the major revolutions in the 20th century, which is Mr. Thomas Pincus. Who knows who is Thomas Pincus in this class? He's not an economist. Thomas Pincus invented the pill, the birth control pill. And this allowed women to choose to have children or not, or to have children at this age, hence to go through a higher education, to get into a profession. This totally made women symmetrical to men regarding fertility. And this was essential. And since the 1950s, so Pincus, the invention was 1953. And since then you have, I mean, in France at least, I don't know in Colombia, I suppose also, I know your mayor in Bogota is a woman. So women have access to all the professions. It is, at the beginning, it's slightly difficult, but basically, women have access to, they can enter the military, they can drive the plane that give bombs, they can do everything that was forbidden for them until I don't know, until 30, 40, 50 years ago. So your generation is lucky. Well, my generation was lucky also, but what I'm saying is that the generation of, I don't know, 80 years ago, something like that, lived in a totally different world.
Listo, muchas gracias. De pronto, para entrar un poquito más en discusión, teníamos esta otra pregunta que está muy relacionada con la que te acabamos de hacer, y es, what are those aspects of women that have been highlighted throughout history and that have not allowed women to participate in science?
I just said, I think, well, children and education and religion, European religion. There might be some religions who do not forbid women to act as another human being, which would not be a woman. But in Europe, it was really religion. It was industrialization in a way, because women in the labor force were cheap labor force. They were not unionized. The trade unions were male trade unions, and they sort of didn't care about women and children working in factories. So again, the 19th century was terrible. And if you are in this condition, whatever your rank in the society, you were not allowed, I mean, you were seldom allowed to have a higher education, and hence you couldn't enter into research academia, or to become a doctor, or to become a biologist, whatever. So it was extremely difficult until, I would say, a century and a half ago, a century and 20 years ago. Little by little, it changed. It changed with the suffragette movement, changed with the early feminist movement, it changed. And of course, you had some exceptions. You had some women in our discipline, you had some women who were wonderful, who were feminists, who fought, who were free, who wrote and all that. But there were really exceptions.
Okay. Gracias por la aclaración. Tenemos entendido que tú quieres hacer como un tipo de presentación o tienes algo preparado para nosotros. No sé en qué momento nos quieras compartir esto, y pues también queremos que los demás estudiantes hagan más preguntas. Entonces, pues no sé cómo quieras pues organizar estas dos partes.
Voy a empezar ahora. Well, what I tried when
si
Erich
quieres,
invited me.
Perdón, Annie,
Yes.
si quieres, Daniel tiene la mano levantada para hacer una pregunta, yo creo, con respecto
Sí, por
a lo que
cierto.
estabas diciendo.
Yo
Entonces,
no lo veo desde aquí, desde mi
yo
computador.
sé, por eso me atreví a interrumpir. Entonces, si quieres, Daniel, haz tu pregunta y después le damos la palabra a Annie para que nos cuente su presentación.
Sí, muchas gracias. Pues es una pregunta rápida, y es ¿por qué crees que en tan poquito tiempo ocurrieron tantos cambios? Pues como mencionabas que todo esto fue posible hasta hace muy poco, como 60 años. Entonces, ¿por qué crees que en tan poco tiempo se dieron como estos cambios tan grandes?
Es más de 60 años, son un siglo. Bueno, poco a poco las cosas han cambiado. Bueno, sorry, in English, better for me. There is a word, I don't know the word in English. You know who Max Weber, the sociologist, is? Max Weber, I don't know how you pronounce that. ¿Cómo se dice Max Weber en español?
Max Weber.
Max
Está
Weber.
perfecto.
Max Weber. Tiene esa palabra que a mí me gusta mucho, es que vivimos en un mundo disenchanted, desenchanté, ¿cómo se dice? Desencantado. ¿Cómo se dice?
Desencantado, exactamente.
Desencantado. And I think that what happened with science, what happened with the reign of reason, what happened with technological progress helped a lot in getting rid of this fear which allowed religion to be so important I'm just speaking about European societies. And I think that little by little, this idea that what matters is the society, the relationship between the people, and not just a relationship to God or to the church and to the priest, and God, the church, and the priest in the majority of the religions, whether it is Islam, whether it is Catholicism, whatever, they despise women. They keep women aside. They hide women. Women are impure. Women must suffer. Women. I mean, there is a position of women which changed when the role of religion became less important. In France, the separation between state and the church was 1905. And there was a huge fight, of course. But that means that the state was in charge of the society and the church was in charge of the souls and gods. And again, religion was a private matter, not a public matter. So I think that this movement of the evolution of science, the abandonment of this role given to religion, and allowed the first feminist movement, the suffragettes, the right to vote movement, then the first movements for equal pay for equal work. Then you had the pill, then you had the movement in favor of contraception, in favor of abortion, and well, and then we are in the state where we are. So no, we live in it is very fragile. You can see that in some countries, in the United States, for instance, under Trump, the right to abort was under threat or was abolished in some states. So everything is rather fragile, but there were some strong advances in this sort of former forms of feminism where I don't know how many in France, I don't remember, I think 10,000 women died every year from abortion. Because it was illegal. So all those advances helped, again, it's a spectrum, helped women to be able, for centuries, the big difference is that women had children and men did not, if I may say. I mean, men had children, but they were not obliged to take care of them. Men were not pregnant. And so this choice that we all have now is essential. I think played an essential role. I don't know if this answers your question.
Gracias.
Tenemos otras dos manos levantadas, entonces, pues mejor, creo que están relacionadas con el tema, entonces si quieres, Nicolás.
Sí, ahorita que estabas diciendo que nuestras generaciones eran, que tu generación y nuestra generación, estaba pensando la pregunta en inglés y ahora el español se me enredó. You were talking about how your generation and our generation was very lucky, but I feel that the discussions that your generation were having on gender issues were very different to the ones we're having today. Liberal feminists in your generation started to break all the boundaries that didn't allow, in a legal way and a physical way, women to get to certain places. Well, now it's more like even though there are still legal boundaries to women, it's more sort of a epistemological and it's more a problem of discourse and epistemology that liberal feminists in their moment thought wouldn't be a problem. They thought that just taking out these legal boundaries, women would be free to improve and achieve all the places in society. And now we're seeing that is not true, and there are other things to discuss. I wanted to ask you if you think that from your perspective are other issues that we are not thinking about general problems and feminism, that when we solve all the problems we're talking now, will still make women not improve in society or have an equal place in development.
I think nobody thought that it would be so easy, but women were dying and women could not go to school or to university at least. And I mean, you had to pass those boundaries, those legal boundaries, which had to do with fertility, basically. It's fun because I did some work on Jeremy Bentham, the utilitarian philosopher. I don't know if the word sounds familiar. The name sounds familiar. And Bentham has those pages which are absolutely amazing on women, explaining that the only thing that really mattered was that women were able to control their fertility. And that if a man and a woman had a love relationship, there was no reason why the woman became pregnant and not the man. So he was in favor of contraception, of abortion, and even in favor of infanticide, saying, well, for the first 3 months, it's not really a human being. And if the woman cannot get rid of the baby, if the baby was not desired and all that, it is better to kill the baby. Even today, it is shocking. It's better to kill the baby. Otherwise, she falls into prostitution, and this is a social evil. It's a personal evil for her and a social evil. So you always had, well, this was the 18th century, not the 19th century, but you had this movement explaining that this was a major obstacle. It doesn't mean that, well, gender is socially constructed. So it's not only a matter of what is allowed by legal methods. It's definitely a matter of how a society considers women. I'm saying that I think it did make quite a lot of progress. It's not perfect, but it did make quite a lot of progress compared to the moment where women did not control the fertility, where women did not have access to some professions which were forbidden, where women did not have access, for instance, to medical studies, did not have access to science studies, and so on and so forth. I'm not saying it's easy today. I'm just saying that some of those rules have been abolished. But this is in good old little Europe, and it is extremely fragile. Some countries in Europe are going back on the question of contraception, abortion, and all that. Some countries accept that women are paid much less than men, and so on and so forth. So all this is extremely fragile. But these were first steps. Nobody in my generation thought, well, in the feminist of my generation, thought that everything would be solved. That, of course. Camila has a question. I can see the hand now. I can see some of the hands. I don't see everybody's. Let me try and see everybody.
Yeah. ¿Ahí me escuchan?
Sí?
Okay. So I have a question that is a bit out of the topic, but I think is related with gender and intersectionality. And I would like to know how in a country like France that has such a political environment, like related to rights, for example, are gender freedoms or gender equality supported? Like, my question is if you can make a comparison between countries like yours and ours in a political and economical way.
Oh, I'm totally unable to. I mean, I love Colombia, but everything I know from Colombia is from Erich, so you should ask Erich directly. I'm totally unable to answer that. I don't know. I definitely don't know the regulations and the situation of women. And I think Colombia has this mix. You were speaking of intersectionality, has this mix of social groups. I don't like, in France, we don't use the term race. So how do you say that? The color of your skin, or the...
Or we call them like ethnic groups here in Colombia. We
yes,
don't
ethnic
use
groups,
race.
Ethnic groups, social groups, which is within an ethnic groups, within the descendant of the Spaniards, you have some very poor people, some very rich people, or descendant of the Germans, sorry, Eric. So yeah, I think the mix, well, we have this mix in France, of course, but the mix has stronger roots. It is like in the United States, the history is different from the descendant of slaves, from the Afro-American who came as slaves to the United States, and the migrants from Asia or from South America. The history is not the same. And the construction of racism is not the same. And the construction of discrimination is not the same. So I'm not able to compare because I don't know I know the roots. I know the roots of the colonization. I know the roots in Europe or in France. I don't know them. I'm totally unable to answer your question.
Can I change my question? For example, how do you think all of those gender freedoms and gender equality in general is supported in France, for example? In like what things do you think are the
like always, you have progressive people, not progressive in the sense of the United States, but people who are sort of, it's more or less right and left, but you have some left people who are definitely not progressive on those things. You have groups of people who want to get rid of those old social construction of women being inferior, whatever the field is. And you have groups of people who are conservative and who think that women should stay in the family and that women are not able to perform the same things than men, and that women are not intelligent like men, and that women blah 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 are here to raise children and cook and make their husband or their companions or their lovers happy. You still have this, of course you have this, and this is going through the whole society. It's going through in the poor, in the equivalent of the barrios near Paris. The machismo. How do you say machismo? You say that? Yes, macho. Yeah. You say machismo. The machismo of the boys is much more terrible than in the rich part of the cities. So it is very mixed. It is. I have some students, lovely students, charming, 20, 21 years old, like that, come from those difficult part of the city. And I think that 3 or 4, in fact, told me that when they had to get their degree, because when they were 12 or 13, they were raped by, I don't know, one was 7, the other one was 11 boys of the same building. And they met those boys since then every day in the building or around, and they said, I want to go away. I need the degree. This is not something that happens in Lausanne. It might happen in Lausanne. What I'm saying is that we have in the system in France is public universities, not very few private universities, but so you have a social mix. And those girls are absolutely, they are great, they are lovely, they are beautiful, they are charming, they look happy and all that, and they tell you those stories. And this is today. So no, of course things are not settled.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, or do you want me to make, I tried to think about what Eric asked me, which is what, as a historian of economic thought, how can you introduce gender in your agenda? This was more or less the question, at least it's the question that I understood. Maybe it was not Eric's question.
But it's not mine, no, it's Daniela's, Mariana's, and Laura's.
Okay, anyway, it was more or less the question that I understood, and I tried to deal with it. So I tried to thought of it, and I found sort of 3, well, I found 17 or 18 different answers, but I tried to match them in three different, as a historian of economic thought, how could I take into account women or the question of gender? So found three basic angles. One angle is, the first one is the most obvious one. And I think one of the questions that Erich sent me about remembering and discovering forgotten figures, it is what Amartya Sen, Amartya Sen has this lovely article on a terrible subject, but the article is very nice, on what he calls the missing women. The missing women is the girls who are the subject of abortion, since we have the photographic, the imagery techniques. So when women want to abort, they abort if it's a girl, and they keep the baby if it's a boy. So there are, I don't know how many millions missing women in India and in general in Asia. And so this idea of missing women can be translated into the way history of economic theories or history of economists has been written. And there, of course, there are some women who did play a role in the writing of the discipline, the writing of the field, and who begin only now to appear. So these were, they were what we could call collaborator. They worked for their husband, or they work for a professor, or they work in a research group doing the math or the stat, or doing, something in between a secretary who types the text, and some had math degrees and statistical degrees or economics degrees, but they were still sort of not signing the articles and doing the basic work. You have then you had in the end of the 18th century, in the 19th century, I mentioned that you had the first translators, and then you had some authors in their own name. I can go back to it. This is just an introduction, and I'll take some examples. Then a second way, so one gesture, one act of a historian of economic theories, or economics, of economists, whatever, would be to just sort of see that Mary Paley, Alfred Marshall's wife, did write Industry and Trade with him. He wiped his name off the second edition, but she co-signed the first one. And so you have all those women who do not appear and who are behind the great men. The great men could be a professor, could be another economist, could be their husband, could be whoever. So taking those missing women in the history of economic theories. The second thing is trying to do some research on what economists, since economics became an autonomous discipline, which is, I would say, in the middle of the 18th century, before it was not an autonomous discipline, what economists or what political economy had to say about some specific conditions related to gender, like women and education, women in the labor force, which means the conditions of work, which means the glass ceiling, which means different underpaid wages, which means no unions. So what economists or the discourses in political economy had to say about that, about education, about prostitution, about birth control, about demography, about the impossibility to get a divorce, about the fact that they couldn't sign a check when checks existed. In many countries, they didn't have some property rights. They couldn't inherit, only boys could inherit. And of course, but this comes later, everything that concerns domestic work, everything that concerns domestic production, and more recently, the fact that, and Amartya Sen again has this strong position on the fact that there is a link between gender and development or underdevelopment, which is that women suffer much more from economic underdevelopment than men. They are in a position where they have a sort of a double exploitation linked to the situation of the poor countries. So you have all this development on the capabilities with Martha Nussbaum and all that. And the third one, and then I can elaborate if you want to, I can elaborate on the three. The third one is the idea that as a historian of economic theories or economic thought, it is extremely interesting to go and see, even if it is marginal, to go and see what authors, men, economists, wrote about women as what they wrote about slaves, about colonies, about homosexuality, about all those questions which were not considered as the hardcore of the discipline. The hardcore of the discipline had to deal with markets, firms, money, prices, equilibrium, and so on and so forth. This is what we've all been trained into. So the idea is that a lot of them wrote about war, wrote about women, wrote about slavery. And this perspective, this is what Michel Foucault does when he considers that to understand normality in a given society, you have to go and see the prisons or the madhouses, or you have to go to the margins. This is also what a French philosopher called Georges Canguilhem, who wrote a book called The Normal and the Pathological. He says, if you want to understand normality, you have to go and analyze what is considered as pathological in a given society. So in that sense, I would say that in the 18th and 19th century, and even in the 20th and 21st century, the question of women, of domestic work, of the double exploitation of women can be considered as sort of pathological compared to the normality of the mainstream objects of economic theory. And it is always an extremely interesting place to put your camera on and to film the center, the hardcore, from the perspective of those margins. So this is more of a methodological or epistemological perspective on historiography. So do you want me to sort of elaborate a little bit on those 3 points, or do you already know exactly who are the first women and what can be said and blah, blah, blah. The last thing I forgot, and which is in my notes, is that I think historians of economic thought also today should write the history of feminist economics, which is a history which basically dates from the 20th century only, but okay, it's part a century ago. It's definitely part of our corpus. I have some students writing PhDs on behavioral economics, which began 50 years ago, 40 years ago, so, or neuroeconomics, which began 30 years ago, 20 years ago. So the idea is also that it is extremely interesting to see what the different types of feminism entered, not history of economic thought, but entered the academic world of economists, and what they did point at and how they worked and how they criticized standard economic theories and all that. So these are my 4 points. I have no idea how you organize your seminars usually. So do you want me to sort of elaborate on the type of women that can be considered from a history of economic thought perspective, or do you absolutely know that? I don't know. Tell me.
Eso estaría perfecto. La verdad no.
But you know already that.
De las mujeres que nos dices que podrían ser como.
So, among the authors, basically, I told you there are, in a way, you have three groups. If you take seriously the first women who are considered as writing within the field of economics or political economy, which was the former term. You have, since the 19th century, you had some women who were feminists who wrote, like Olympe de Gouges, who wrote a little bit of economics, but basically women who did really know and took seriously the corpus of political economy or of economic theory. And this began in the 19th century. So you have three major groups. You have a first group, which is the women who had this popularization work. They wrote novels, they were stories for children or short stories, like Jane Marcet or Harriet Martineau, and illustrating the theories of Ricardo, of Malthus, of Adam Smith, and taking economic theories and trying to transform those theories into a popular knowledge, into a knowledge which was available to everybody. And this went through novels, short stories, and all that. This was a first group. And I would put the translators slightly in the same category, because theoretically they would only translate from English to French, from French to Italian, from Italian to English, or whatever. They would, but as I told you, a lot of those women did add a lot of things and transform what they were translating. So it was a way for them to write books, treatises on political economy, even though they were not supposed to, because they were women. There is a lovely article by Evelyn Forget in Hope. I don't have the reference here. On four women, if I remember well, you had Jane Marcet, you had Harriet Martineau, you had Clémence Royer, and who was the fourth one? I forgot the fourth one, who were translators and played an extremely important role with the author they translated and within the academic community of their time in economics. The second group is the collaborators. The collaborators were often strongly collaborating, which means that definitely they wrote half of it. Mary Paley, for just one book she wrote without. Mary Paley was highly educated, had a PhD in economics. She married out. She was the first professor to teach in Cambridge, first woman professor to teach in Cambridge, in a small college, but still in Cambridge, at Cambridge. She wrote one book in 1879 with Alfred Marshall, whom she had married. And she definitely did more of half of the, she did half of the job. So, but of course, this is what was called the Matthew effect. There is now a Matilda effect, copied from the Matthew effect. Marshall was being much better known a few years after. Everybody forgot about Mary Paley and attributed everything to Mary Paley. So you had Harriet Taylor with John Stuart Mill. All these women existed, but basically to the posterity, to the standard mainstream Whig history of thought, they do not exist as much as the great man. So you had Harriet Taylor, you had Mary Paley, you had the widow of Jevons, Harriet Jevons, who published, when William Stanley Jevons died, she published her book. She did put in order all the posthumous writing and she edited the book. It is what Elizabeth Schumpeter did. Joseph Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis was put together and edited by his wife. You had Vera Lutz, who worked with his husband called Lutz. And so these are the collaborators. You have another type of collaborator who does exist in a much more symmetrical way. And I would take the example of Beatrice Potter, who was the wife of Sidney Webb, and they both were organizer of the Fabian Society, which was a sort of a social democrat, we would say today, society in Great Britain, working with the trade unions, a non-Marxist left trade unionist group. And they published a lot of work on the industrial world and the relationship between capital and labor in England. And she was a journalist before, she had a great notoriety, and they were definitely on an equal perspective. So she was a collaborator, but he was a collaborator to her also. So you have Beatrice Potter. Then comes the moment of the first full-time economist, which is economists who definitely do write a treatise or a book, which is important, which matters. And here I told you the first one was undoubtedly Rosa Luxemburg. The first important one was Rosa Luxemburg, who's best known as a woman engaged into politics and engaged into the labor movement. But the Accumulation du Capital, the capital accumulation, is definitely an important book in the Marxist literature. You have, of course, John Robinson. You have Barbara Wharton, who in the 30s wrote about the question of planification and welfare, about the same sort of themes than Beveridge. You have Vera Smith, who wrote on central banking. You have Marion Bowley, who wrote on Nassau, an important book on Nassau Senior, who was not known. Nancy Ruggles, who worked on marginal cost pricing. You have, of course, Elizabeth Penrose, who wrote on the size of the firms, the optimal size of the firms. You have Vera Lutz, who wrote on labor market and development economics. So you have this group who tackled some standard objects in economic theory, and another group who began to work on a specific domain of economics where women were concerned, which was called home economics. So home economics was a sort of, at the beginning, art and science of home management. You have an international society for home economics, which got established, I think, in 1908, if I remember well. And this was it was only a matter of women teaching, and it was sort of a teaching of how to be a good housewife, more or less, in secondary and higher education. Little by little, you have some women, one of the first being Hazel Kirk, who take this seriously and transform home economics into an economic theory of family consumption. So Hazel Kirk becomes professor at the University of Chicago, which was already extremely prestigious at that time, and has this PhD student called Margaret Reed, who goes on that. So Hazel Kirk and Margaret Reed do have an extremely important legacy on this question of household economics, family consumption, on this domain, which directly comes from the home economics. This would lead to two different legacies. One is, chronologically, one is what the Chicago people, Jacob Mincer, Gary Becker, called the new home economics, when they applied those microeconomic tools to mathematization, econometrics of the family in a very conservative perspective. But still, instead of saying, well, the family is like an economic agent, they began to speak about what happened in the family with hypotheses that you can highly criticize. But they began to say, okay, there is a negotiation between the father and the mother and the parents and the children. So they began to open up this black box of the family in a way that I spend my whole thesis criticizing them. So I do not agree with them, but they were the first one in the mainstream to open up this box. And of course, the second group is the feminist economists who work today on the care, on domestic labor. And there was, if I remember well, a lovely, in the 90s, I would say the 1995 or 6, a lovely issue of Feminist Economics, the review, edited by Nancy Folber, or edited by, I don't know. There was a big article on Nancy Folber and devoted to Margaret Reed. Margaret Reed had just died. And the idea was working on the care, working on, as feminist economics, on household production, all this production where women are involved and that are not considered as real production or valuable production by our societies. And they said this is, they paid a tribute to Margaret Reed for that. So Margaret Reed can be at the same time a grandmother for the Chicago school and a grandmother for the feminist economists. And then after, it begins after you have a lot of moments. So I'm stopping there because these are really the founders, the first women. The second theme we can try to discuss is what did feminist economists work on at the beginning? So basically, you have to say that the legal studies or sociology took a much greater attention to the question of the situation of women, of domestic labor, the care and all that sort of things, or inequalities on the labor market, than economists. And this came rather late. Basically, one of the first to write about the specificity of women in economics was Esther Bosrop in 1970, explaining that men and women in the women-facing economic development, explaining that men and women do not survive development or crisis or macroeconomics movement in the same way, and that women suffer much more from crises or cycles or underdevelopment than men for many reasons, with many examples. Then you have another field which was launched basically in the 80s, which is quite late, by Marilyn Waring in a book called If Women Counted, a New Feminist Economics, and attacking national accounting, attacking the system of indicators, the system of statistics, of measurement, attacking the invisibility of domestic labor in the system of national accounting. Then you had some, in the 90s, you had some criticism of Gary Becker's Treatise of the Family, and hence a criticism of mainstream economics, what mainstream economics did right on women. Still in the 90s, it began with historians of thought. You have a book by Michel called Feminism and Anti-Feminism in Early Economic Thought, who began to reread the classical theories and the marginalist theories at the light of what was their position towards women, or what was their position toward men, which is the same thing, if I may say. I mean, what was their position towards this patriarchal system linked to capitalism? Then, of course, you have the two books by Marianne Ferber and Julie Nelson called Beyond Economic Men. So why two books? There was one in 1993, the other one 10 years later in 2003. And it was called Beyond Economic Men, Feminist Theory and Economics. The second one was called Feminist Economics Today, Beyond Economic Men. And basically, it is a criticism of standard economic theories from not standard economic theories when they spoke about women, not like Gary Becker and the Treatise on Family, but standard economic theory from its foundation, from the hypothesis of rationality, from economic methodology. So it was a critical lecture reading of standard economics from a critical perspective, which was a feminist perspective. Well, then you have many different things. You had Marxist feminists, you had a lot of different, today you have a movement which is much wider. But I think these were the major steps. And I concentrated, I didn't take the European, concentrate on the American literature, because I suppose this is what you have most access to. In Europe, of course, you had also all those debates on domestic labor, on patriarchy. So you had the Marxist social feminist versus the cultural essentialist feminist, and all this also appeared in the field of economic theory, of history, of economic thought. Would this be, I know that I'm supposed to be short, and I'm not short, so I shall stop here. I know you also wanted to speak about ecofeminism, and some of those themes will appear in what I have to say on ecofeminism. But I worked much more. I mean, I could be able to speak for 3 hours, and I had to make it short. So if you have questions, I'll be glad to answer.
Vale, muchas gracias, Annie. Pues respecto a esto, pues queremos invitar a los demás a que hagan sus preguntas también. Yo, con respecto a lo que nos acabas de contar, te quería preguntar, pues, de los grupos de mujeres que nos contabas, digamos, para una de las lecturas de la clase de hoy, decían que las biografías era como la mejor manera de como record esas participaciones que han tenido las mujeres. Entonces, pues, leyendo esto, ¿cuál creerías tú que debería ser esa metodología para como identificar o documentar o comparar y analizar la participación de las mujeres en la historia y pues en lo que se viene?
I wouldn't say there is one methodology. There's many. This is why I said there are different things. You can try to work on those women who participated into the construction of the field that I just mentioned for the first ones. You can work on what male economists worked about women. You can work on the link between the social condition of women at a given period of time and space and what political economy or economic theory said about this social position. There are many perspectives. I don't think you should privilege only one. I think you have to be plural and to attack it by multiple ways. There is not one methodology, but it is per se an extremely interesting standpoint, perspective. Again, if you put your camera on this question, the gender issues in economic theories, it doesn't allow you to deal with all the subjects. I mean, the modelization, econometric modelization, you won't learn much from this. Maybe you will, but I don't think you will know. but you will learn a lot on some basic foundations of not only mainstream economics, even on Marxian economics, even on institutionalist economics, even on Keynesian economics. It is an interesting perspective to ask questions, to be reflexive towards a given corpus in economic theory. So it is again, it's always interesting to go and see at the margin. I'm not saying that women are marginal in the society, but I'm saying that it's a marginal object until today for standard economic theories. And when I say standard, I include Marxian, I include Keynesian, I include institutionalist, I include a lot of things. So if you take most of the theories, the reflections on women or on gender is marginal. The reflection, the content is not marginal, but the space allowed to those reflections is marginal. It's always interesting to go and see the marginal in order to have a historical perspective. I mean, to not only to go to the hardcore, not only to go to the mainstream. And there is a mainstream in Marxian theories, and there is a mainstream in institutional theories. So I wouldn't say there is one methodology. I don't know if this answers the question. No, by definition, it doesn't, because I say there is not one method.
Vale, gracias. No sé si los demás estudiantes tengan más preguntas pues, respecto a lo que acabamos de hablar, o si no, pues seguimos con el siguiente tema.
Perdón, yo tenía una pregunta, si nadie más
sí,
se atreve.
Te voy a hablar la mano.
Perdón, pero pueden no darme la palabra, está perfecto.
No, dale.
No, es que con tu pregunta, Daniela, y con la respuesta de Annie, pues me surge una pregunta acerca de como los desafíos, como los challenges que pueden tener o que podemos tener los historiadores del pensamiento económico en términos, otra vez, historiográficos, en términos de fuentes, digamos, cuáles pueden ser las barreras, las limitaciones que este objeto de estudio, digamos, cierto, de los márgenes que pueden ser las mujeres, pero no solamente las mujeres, sino también el género entendido de diferentes maneras, digamos, implica para nosotros como historiadores del pensamiento económico, ¿cierto? Evidentemente, a mí se me ocurre un problema muy grande que es obviamente el de los archivos, ¿cierto? Cuando queremos estudiar algún economista como, no sé, por coger uno al azar, Larry Klein, pues evidentemente hay muchísimos archivos sobre él, ¿cierto? Pero si quisiéramos estudiar, por ejemplo, los archivos de cualquiera de las economistas que mencionaste, la cosa es mucho más difícil. Entonces, ese se me ocurre que es uno de los desafíos directos más importantes que uno puede tener, y al mismo tiempo donde los historiadores del pensamiento económico debemos ser mucho más innovadores, ¿cierto? Pero quería preguntarte qué otro tipo de desafíos crees tú que podemos tener en historia del pensamiento económico para hacer que estas preguntas entren realmente como dentro del núcleo de nuestra, por ejemplo, de nuestra formación también en el máster de París 1 o en otros lugares donde estamos formando personas en este sentido.
I can't answer because, of course, archival material is missing. And I know that the list of women that I mentioned exists because they had a recognition in their time, and hence you have published materials, you have articles of books. The other ones, some do not have. And for instance, I happened to fall on, I was working on a sort of prehistory of experimental economics. So what were the sort of attempted experiments before World War II, during the interwar periods? And I realized that some women did experiment on consumption related to home economics. There was Blanche Peixoto, for instance, on the West Coast, I don't remember well, maybe Berkeley, who did some experiments. What? Berkeley?
Sorry, she was at Berkeley, yeah.
Berkeley, I think so. So Blanche Peixoto, for the moment, there was no PhD. There was a PhD on Hazel Kirk. There was a PhD on Margaret Reed, a PhD on book articles. Blanche Peixoto, there is not much things. I happened to find her looking at those first experiments, and there were sort of randomized results of interviews. I mean, it doesn't resemble a standard experiments, but nobody knew what experimental economics could be. So you have by chance, the only thing is that when you pick up a woman, you just say, hey, it's a woman, it might be interesting. That's the only sort of little light that you should keep in mind. But otherwise, it's extremely difficult. I think that historians might tell us much more than what we know. And maybe historians of science, I think they are engaged in this attention to gender questions in their own discipline. I think we are the economists and historians of economic thought. We are among the last in the social sciences. We're extremely late. But it's extremely strange because I did some work on a seminar before World War II in France. And I realized that the man who held this seminar, Gaëtan Pirou, was the supervisor of more or less half of the first PhD thesis written by women. So I began to inquire about the woman who wrote a PhD in economics, and I realized that there were it was much later than in legal studies, in law. And then I looked at this agrégation, the competition I just mentioned before, in order to become full professor. So the first woman who got an agrégation in law was in the 20s or something like that. The first woman was in 1946, after World War II. Then 10 years after, you had another one. And I began to sort of note. So I took the list of the people from the agrégation, and I did put the names. And I went on, and it sort of was in the National Library, and I went on, I took notes, and all of a sudden I fell on my name, which is that we were not so many. And I think I was number, I don't know what, 40. I mean, it was, you realize that, and then I stopped because I said, whoops, I cannot be object and subject at the same time. But the idea is that this work had never been done before. I didn't even totally finish it. I didn't publish it. But this is, you have to go into whatever archive you can find, whatever memories you can find, and I think that historians of science have a lot to teach us on those questions. Other questions?
Bueno, pues si no hay más preguntas, si quieres nos cuentas un poco de el ecofeminismo.
Yes, ecofeminism. It's very strange because I had totally forgotten that the word came from France. Hey. A woman that was, where are my notes on that? A woman that was a feminist in the 70s called Françoise d'Aubonne. I can write you the name, in a book whose French title translated would be Feminism or Death. And then another one, which is The Time for Ecofeminists. She coined the word. Although the idea was already appeared, not the word ecofeminist. Ecofeminist doesn't come from economics and feminism, but ecology and feminism. And basically, there was an author, an American author called Rachel Carson in the early 60s, in 1962, who wrote on, how do you call that, the pesticide, would you say that in English, pesticidos? The DDT, do you know what the DDT is? Eric, ¿ça existe le DDT en español?
Sí, pues pesticidas que se empezaron a utilizar en la
So
agroindustria.
she wrote a book on the pesticides, and she linked this fight against, she was the one who basically was instrumental in a law forbidding the use of the DDT in the United States. And she linked this plea against the pesticide to a feminist perspective. So she was the first to put this together. And then you had Françoise Daubonne, and you had women's movement all around the planet. You had an important one in India, where they fought against deforestation, the fact of abolishing cutting down the forest. And so these women, they were both feminist and ecologists, the first ecologist movement, and they little by little, they named themselves ecofeminism. Then you began to have conferences on both nuclear accident, ecological consequences, and an accent on the consequences of these ecological catastrophes, specifically on women. Basically, this ecofeminism is tries to analyze two forms of domination: a male domination upon women and a human domination upon nature, and tries to make a symmetry between those two types of relationship. So, like for feminism, you have a wide spectrum of different branches of ecofeminism. You have what I would call a cultural ecofeminism, which is based on the ethics of care. I mentioned this notion of care, which is usually attributed to women. And the idea is that what the battle for a better ecological equilibrium of the planet, and the battle for women who do take care not only of children or human beings, but of animals and of the nature, could be the same. So you have this cultural ecofeminism, where the idea is that the cultural of women is a cultural of care. You have a much more political ecofeminism, which introduces a third type of domination, not only male domination upon women, not only human domination upon nature, but colonial and post-colonial domination upon the populations of the countries which had been colonized. So this is more social and political, but also the idea is that colonialism is considered as a drama in matter of ecology, and a drama, more specifically, a drama that underlines this exploitation of women in colonized country. So basically, this type of ecofeminism is centered on health and vulnerability. You have another type, which is an essentialist ecofeminism, and this is rather developed. It is a bit exotic for Europe because it's much more developed in United States and maybe in South America, where basically this ecofeminism is related to sort of founding myths on the Mother Earth, on the feminine principle, on the idea that it is men who destroy the planet and not women, with the idea that there is an essence of women, meaning that women would not harm the planet, would not harm the animals, would not harm the other human being, whereas men do. So there is this idea that if you are born a woman, it's not Simone de Beauvoir, you're not born a woman, you become a woman, which is a woman. Gender is a social construction. There is the idea that being born a woman leads you to a different attitude towards ecology than men. And then you have a sort of materialist or neo-Marxist ecology with the idea that, and this exists since the early feminists of the 70s, the idea that the exploitation of women by men can be analyzed in the same framework than class struggle of the exploitation of labor by capital. So this idea that the basic framework is capitalism and exploitation in order to analyze both the ecological problems and the gender problems. So what do all these groups have in common? They are all critical of patriarchy. They are all critical of capitalism. They are all, which again is more complicated in Europe, they are all critical of rationalism in the postmodern sense, explaining that rationality was one of the vectors for both capitalism, male dominance, and so they are critical of rationalism and materialism. They are critical, of course, of industrial agriculture, of the merchandization, the market relationship on anything which is living, the treatment of animals, and all this. If I may say, we all agree. I mean, this is a consensus, not a dissensus. They are critical also, more or less all of them, apart from the really materialists, they are critical of the dualism in the Occidental thought, a dualism where you have, so it's complicated because some are critical, but they accept it in their own way, and some other dualists where you would have on the one hand the women nature and indigenous, and on the other hand man, culture, and colonialism. So you had the power on the one hand and the exploited ones on the other hand. So this could be a criticism of this idea that the oppression is the same. Well, no, I'm sorry, my sentence is badly constructed. This could be a criticism of a common oppression of women by man, of indigenous by colons, and of nature by culture, which means by human intervention. Or this could be an epistemological criticism of this dual form of thought. So this opens to two discussions which were already being discussed in the feminist movement since the 60s or 70s. One discussion on the question of the essence. Again, Simone de Beauvoir, you're not born a woman, you become a woman, which means that gender is socially constructed. And it doesn't mean the same thing to be a woman in a given society or a given group of people and in another society. So this idea of a social construction, for the essentialists, there is an essence of masculinity and femininity. And hence, the risk for the critique would be that women have to be locked down in what is their traditional role, which is have children and take care of the others and take care of the health, the food and all that. So is the essence of women this, because they are the one who give birth? It's a question that you can discuss. The second discussion is again on the type of feminist. Is it a feminist, what I would call materialist, which is, and this is one of the questions that was asked before, is feminism a fight for the social and historical conditions of women, which is discrimination, segregation, exploitation, and all that, because they are historically a group which is exploited, a group which is dominated? Or is it differentialist? Is feminism a discourse assuming that women are different, that women are not interested in the political power, are not interested in science, are not interested in abstraction, are not interested in rationality, and that their essence is related to nature, to children, and to more or less care and domestic work. So these are extremely interesting questions. They discuss it. Is entirely different. The first group will use a traditional type of rhetorics, which is articles and books and demonstrations and analysis. The second book would sort of reject the idea that this academic language is male dominated, is capital dominated, is related to a system that they reject, and hence their type of literature, their type of argumentation goes through poetry and painting and art. And so the idea is that they have to find a new language, which would be a language proper to this essence of women as entirely different from the essence of men. So the discussion is open, and I would like to hear you on all those questions. Now it's my turn to ask questions.
Creo que fue mucha información, that is a lot of information, y son igual como discusiones muy, pues que generan mucho debate, mucha polémica, y es difícil tomar posición. Y justamente te quería preguntar, como que estaba pensando ahorita que nos hablas de estas dos discusiones, pues ¿cuál es tu posición al respecto? Tú que tienes mucha más experiencia.
No, yo pregunté la primera. Tienen que darme respuestas. Después le puedo decir, pero primero, todos los estudiantes, boys and girls.
Nicolás, dale.
Hay una autora que a mí me gusta mucho, que no sé si hace parte del ecofeminismo, pero que hace una crítica muy fuerte a Lacan, que es Luz Irigaray, que habla mucho de esa relación con el cuerpo, porque habla mucho de la construcción de la identidad de la mujer respecto al cuerpo y cómo esa relación con el cuerpo es algo que el hombre no puede entender, porque ella habla como, por ejemplo, la mujer rompe con la racionalidad en cuanto que todo el tiempo es una persona besándose a pesar de ser una, ¿no? Porque son todo el tiempo, su vagina son dos labios, que al mismo tiempo es uno, pero todo el tiempo es múltiple, y que al mismo tiempo es interior. Pero, por otro lado, también, ¿hasta qué punto dentro de una sociedad patriarcal eso termina siendo también una excusa para que del otro lado se discrimine en nombre de ese esencialismo del ecofeminismo, ¿no? En vez de valorarlo, porque aquí también hemos discutido muchas veces si la lucha debería ser incluir a las mujeres dentro de este sistema racional, patriarcal y súper cuantitativo, cuando hablamos de la economía, o más bien feminizar todos los métodos y descentralizar el patriarcado, ¿no? Entonces, ahí también te preguntaría a ti como, ¿dónde ves viable? Porque entre eh, centralizar el patriarcado, porque por ejemplo ahorita también hay mucho por parte del feminismo radical que hablan de cómo pues para el feminismo radical es a través del género que se oprime a la mujer en cuanto a cuerpo, y eso también abre muchas puertas para que haya una discriminación de la mujer corpórea, ¿no? Y no dentro del género.
What is extremely interesting is that it's the same thing with nature. I know it is the same thing. It's for a long time in Europe, the reference to nature against culture was a reactionary or right-wing reference. The idea being, if it is nature, then there is a natural order, then it is normal that the poor be poor and the rich be rich and the man be man and the woman be woman. So the idea that if the natural order was an order of nature, this was a way of legitimizing the existent order, which was capitalist, patriarchal, whatever, which was a hierarchical order, where the inferiors were considered as naturally inferiors. And this was at the basis of racism, of a lot of things when there was this government, this pro-Nazi government during World War II in France. The motto was, nature doesn't lie. Society lies, politics lie, but nature doesn't lie. And this was a way of saying, well, let us keep it was an extremely conservative reference to the state of society. Nature doesn't lie means there is no need of fighting against a state of things because it's a natural order. So it's the same thing with this essentializing of nature. So essentializing women or essentializing nature. What is extremely interesting in ecofeminism is that it's not only the type of intersectionality and a type of struggles. All this is very interesting. What is extremely interesting from a philosophical perspective is that there is this, you have the same debate in ecology and in feminism. Is nature an essence, or is it an object which is submitted to terrible attacks today because of globalization, because of everything that we know? And it's the same thing. Is being a woman an essence, or is it a social construction or historical construction, which is the same thing? So you have the same question, and you had this with Lucy Irigaray, was part of a group called Psychoanalysis and Politics, Psychepo, and it was, and they raised those extremely interesting questions, saying that women being essentially different, they should not use man's language, man's rhetoric, man's tools to struggle for a feminist, from a feminist perspective, or for feminist goals. So it is the same idea that is there an essence of women? Is there an essence of nature? The question is open. My answer is not interesting on that. It is really, what is interesting is the question. It is, what is interesting is the discussion. So of course you can say you have good arguments on both sides, like any interesting quarrels is a quarrel like that. This is why I wanted to hear you.
A mí un poco lo que se me viene a la cabeza es que, pues dada esta discusión como que, y pensando en que las mujeres siempre han estado ahí, solo que nunca han estado como a la luz, igual no sería un discurso de solo hombres, o sea, el sistema, si las mujeres siempre han estado ahí, entonces pues no es un sistema solo construido por hombres, es solo, no sé, como la manera en la que se ha escrito la historia o se ha escrito esta participación de las mujeres, pero no es que las mujeres no hayan estado ahí. Dale, María Alejandra, pues no sé quién alzó primero la mano, Nicolás, creo.
Sí, fue Nicolás.
No, bueno. Iba a comentar, cuando yo tenía mucho esa discusión, en mi cabeza, recuerdo que vi La piel que habito de Almodóvar y me impactó mucho en ese momento cuando lo pensaba porque, digamos, en términos prácticos, muchas de las discusiones que hay es, por ejemplo, la de los espacios compartidos entre hombres y mujeres, ¿no? Por ejemplo, el hecho de que bueno, con los travestis, por ejemplo, dicen que a pesar de que tengan toda esa feminidad, siguen siendo personas que fueron criadas como hombres. Y si uno piensa la masculinidad como una crianza y no como una esencia, entonces son personas que son creadas violentamente y que en consecuencia son una amenaza para las mujeres en ciertos lugares. Y en la película de Almodóvar pasa algo muy raro y es que es un tipo que viola a una mujer y luego como una forma de venganza contra él es que lo convierten en mujer y esa mujer que al mismo tiempo es una mujer que después viola, entonces es un violador que después es una mujer que es violada y se casa con el esposo de la mujer que él violó. Entonces también como hoy en día, a pesar de todas esas esencias, ¿no?, que podemos buscar, hay un montón de configuraciones que el humano ha logrado crear para que no haya esas dicotomías realmente en la forma en la que nos relacionamos con el mundo, ¿no? Es decir, de alguna forma todos jugamos dentro de ese espectro de polos en la vida cotidiana de muchas formas, ¿no? O bueno, no sé, lo digo como hombre, seguramente también un montón de cosas ahí que no estoy teniendo en cuenta, pero...
This is a lesson from psychoanalysis. I mean, even if Freud was definitely not a feminist, the idea that we all have a part in our behavior, in our subconscious, we all have a part from the other gender, that women have a masculine part and that men have a feminine part. This was the first formulation of this idea, which is there is no total duality, or if there is a duality, it is socially constructed. This was expressed by Freud's psychoanalysis the first time.
Dale, María Alejandra.
Bueno, yo no sé qué tan acertado vaya a ser mi comentario, pero estaba pensando que claramente la opresión de la mujer ha sido como por estereotipos de género, que es algo construido. Y en el tema de la naturaleza, yo trataba de hacer un paralelo con tal vez la naturaleza también ha sido oprimida y también por el machismo, y en este caso sería el capitalismo, lo estaba pensando de esa forma, y lo estaba pensando así porque Francisca Gargalo, en su libro de Feminismos desde Abya Yala, menciona precisamente eso, que el capitalismo es sumamente machista porque el individuo es el que busca maximizar su propio beneficio y ese individuo es hombre. Y lo que ella menciona es como, es que no solo es que hayan excluido a las mujeres, sino que también excluyeron indígenas, grupos étnicos, que era lo que estábamos hablando antes. Entonces creo que ese es el paralelo como que yo podría hacer, pero pues no sé qué pienses.
No, estoy escuchando. No tengo preguntas para todo. A mí me interesa mucho, sorry, I'm extremely interested by the debate, which is not a simple debate. I would rather go in the direction of a social construction. If you look at the status of men and women, if you look at the relation to nature in different societies at different moment of time, it is extremely different. So you have more common feature on the situation of women because usually women bear children, and contraception is a recent a role of power. So I think that I'm not on the essence side in the sense that being a woman does not impose a social situation, does not impose a political, when I mean political, it's not right or left, or it's not your vote, but a political position towards the society. And history is full of examples of men who are extremely radical and revolutionary and feminist, and women who are definitely not. So I don't think, and more generally, I think that, maybe because I'm French, I think that people cannot be only defined by their ethnical group, by their gender. It is terrible to say, or by their religion, or by whatever was used in the history to slaughter a group because they were Protestants, because they were Jews, because they were Muslims, because they were whatever, because they were women, because they were gays, because the list, unfortunately, is extremely long. So I don't think that this cataloging of, I think there are some discrimination in a given society. You have some discrimination which are felt by women or by people of such and such origin or such and such social class, of course. And this is a common feature. But to say that it is an essence is a philosophical claim which is extremely strong. I'm not sure there is an I'm more on the Beauvoir side. Not because I'm older than you, it's just philosophically. I don't think that, I think that the fight for the women who are in this seminar to go to the university, which your great-great-grandmother didn't do, or great-grandmother, whatever, I mean, some grandmothers didn't do, it is not linked to an essence of women. Otherwise, 1 century ago, everybody considered that the essence of women was that they could not study math, they could not have a sense of abstraction, they could not go to the university, they were only good for sexual relations and childbearing and caring. Is it really what we want as women? I'm not sure. I don't, at least. I want everything. I want caring and sex and children and abstraction and academic job and philosophy and everything. This is the fun part of being a woman in the 20th or 21st century. But hence, it is not an essence. It is a social construction. I have the right to do a lot more things than again, my great-grandmother did. My many great-grandmothers, because we all have a lot of great-grandmothers. And it is, did I cheat on my feminine essence by being a full professor in Paris 1? I don't think so. So what would be the essence of a woman? What do you do with the people who change sex? what do you do with the desire, with homosexual desire? So I think that it is much more complicated, and that in any society you have a spectrum of different psychological profiles and different social position, and you have a construction of all this. If you read The History of Sexuality by Michel Fouca, it's extremely clear. I mean, it is. You have some elements which are still there from the antique societies until today, but basically the statal, social treatment of sexuality, of family, of the bodies, of the gender are extremely different from one period of time to another. So there is no norm. Hence, there is no essence.
Now, you talk about Foucault's history of sexuality. It reminds me, there's a book by Anne Stoller that takes...
By whom?
By Anne Stoller.
Yes.
That is called Race and Education of Desires, that takes the idea of Foucault to explain the education of desire in colonies in India. And that made me thought that taking apart what one woman to be, there's also have been like a history where all the types of relating to the world, like, or the perspective has been all the time discriminated. So in that way, that idea of we all have a bit of that, and we all have that social constructions doesn't allow to continue those discrimination in which all the other perspectives are not having in account. And that reminded me with the idea of essence in how in India, for example, the classification between being European or not was not part of being born in Europe, but rather having certain milieus is the word that is there, like going through the opera or listening to certain music, even though you were completely Indian or you were entirely Europe. What determines your social place there was not you as a body, but you as an interaction and a social construction. So that idea of social construction doesn't allow to discriminate all the other perspectives that might be in game and that could have been playing a very big role in development, like it did in India by trying to eradicate in education all the other desires that were before the colony.
No, I agree, but you have to always, when you speak about India, you have to remember this deep structure of the caste system, which is that basically all those social structure and social construction you mentioned rely upon this time an essential conception, which is that you're not the same human beings. There's a hierarchy between the caste one with another, and hence between the individuals who belong to this caste. And this is still very present in India. If you're born in a given caste, it's like being born a slave. If you're born in a given class, you are not the same type of human being than in another caste. In the Ancien Régime in France, before the French Revolution, the people did think that the aristocrats had blue blood, which means so it was, you still say that for aristocrat, there is a French expression saying that they have blue blood, but the people thought that they didn't have the same blood than the non-aristocrat. Of course, we all have the red blood. I mean, all human beings have a blood, the same color and the same chemical composition. So this is what I'm bothered by, was this notion of essence, which is that there is such a spectrum of representation, of hierarchies, of segregations, of discriminations, that I don't think that we should adopt them as a weapon in order to fight them. We can fight as a woman today in a given society. But is that an essence? No, it is a social construction of gender.
Going back to the example in India, it was interesting because what she said goes in the entirely opposite direction. The argument was that most of the helps or the status that you could get into in a colonial context, like being treated as an European, was not being born in India or had been born in Europe or being white, but just your social interaction with others.
Yeah, through culture.
That is, and even a white European, a white French person in India could be discriminated because he had an Indian taste, whether it would be, or an Indian education, where an Indian with a very dark skin could be very respected even by English authorities, just because he had a good English and went to the opera.
But you have of course, but you have this in a lot of societies. I don't know, I'm not familiar with the indigenous societies in Colombia, but I know that in Venezuela, when you go to the how do you call that, the forest, the selva, the jungle, along with the villages of the Indians, you have what they call little whites, who are whites who've been living there since generation, who are extremely poor, who are despised by the Indians because they are not Indians, who are despised by the whites because they live with Indians. And yes, of course, I mean, those questions have not much to do with have to do with the culture, not with the color of the skin. The difference, there is a slight difference for women, because again, until Mr. Pincus, I hope this name is now familiar to you, women were the ones who bear children. And it's not an essence, it is a fact, which is a real difference. There is no difference between somebody who has a skin color and that color or that color. There is no difference between a lot of things other than culture. There was this basic natural difference. And the huge event of the 20th century is that this is more or less disappearing, not everywhere, not in the same, but this can be overpassed. Other questions?
Yes, I have another one. Now that you make such emphasis on fertility control, I wanted to ask you, but there is also the worry now about all the effects that hormonal fertility control has on women. And at the same time, most of fertility control investigation has been targeted mainly to women. And there is a huge gap between the methods available to women and men. But you're also emphasizing a bit about the control that women have now on fertility. So would you think it might be a change in the balance of fertility methods might improve freedom to women, or that decision also targeted to man might not be a good idea in your perspective?
I think that at the beginning, when birth control was secure, there was always other methods, but when I say the pill, it's the pill and other methods, but let's say the contraceptive pill, which was basically secure, didn't harm the body. I mean, a lot of people, the church said it's going to destroy the body of the woman. No, not at all. I mean, okay, it worked well. And it allowed women to go to university. It's as simple as that, to get a higher education, hence to get jobs with better wages. There was a conference by a French economist who lives in, I don't know where he teaches, Pierre-André Capory, who is in one of the major universities in the States. He's an economist and a demographer. And he had this, it's also what Angus Deaton is working on since a few years. He has these data explaining that the relationship between the academic results of men and women as a whole, as an average, in the United States the balance is getting to be that women are getting more diplomas. And hence, he says, if we are rational, in 20 or 30 years, women will get better job, will be better paid as an average. And there will be a new model where men in a couple, it will be better for the couple that women work and earn the money and that the man stays at home. So he discusses that. And he says, of course, here you have all the culture and the social construction, the stereotypes and blah, blah, blah. But it is extremely interesting to see that in the United States, it's not in a small country, remote, I don't know where on the planet. In the United States, you have this equilibrium, this balance, which is slightly changing. And there were some articles explaining Trumpism, explaining all those people who voted for Trump, not only voted, but who were extremely at the side of Trump because of this despair of the white man, which is more or less the thesis of Angus Deaton. Explaining that the white man did not have any more family because they didn't have enough money and they didn't have the religions that some of the groups had, and they didn't have blah, blah, blah. So Deaton is extremely interesting on the fact that there's a higher than ever growth in what he calls suicide. Suicide is not only to kill yourself, it can be just to get deeply into drugs, into disease, into alcohol, and shorten your life because your life is meaningless. So what I'm saying is that all those things are changing, and it is extremely, I mean, you cannot deny that the feminist movement, whether it is on climate, this is what the demonstration, the ecofeminist demonstration are about, not the theory, but the practice of demonstration, whether it is for climate change, for nature, for forests, is often by women. There is a strong, I mean, the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century will see this major event of a global and massive mobilization of women on different causes, the causes of women, the causes of nature, the causes of peace. It always did exist. You had women involved in social movements, but it took an ampleur, how do you say that, a size which did not exist before. And it is extremely interesting to observe.
Yo hace un momento, perdón, solamente quería, como decimos aquí, meter la cucharada, Annie, hace un momento, pero creo que con tu última intervención...
¿Qué quiere decir meter la cuchara?
Dar un poco mi opinión así de forma arbitraria, digamos, en este caso. Pero creo que en tu última intervención justamente hiciste esa distinción que yo quería como problematizar un poco entre la parte más teórica o más filosófica también de esta discusión sobre el esencialismo de ser mujer, de ser hombre, etcétera, y la parte más de la práctica y sobre todo llevada a las luchas políticas, ¿cierto? Porque obviamente yo por muchísimas razones, entre otras cosas por mi formación, pues estoy de acuerdo con lo que tú estabas diciendo y lo que estaban diciendo los y las estudiantes acerca de, obviamente, la construcción de los cuerpos, de las identidades, de las representaciones de género, etcétera, sociales y culturales, desde el punto de vista filosófico, desde el punto de vista histórico. Pero creo que, digamos, para problematizar esto, me parece importante también entender que ciertos movimientos políticos y sociales en algunos momentos tienen que tratar de buscar cierta identidad con algo que de pronto a veces yo creo que está mal llamado una esencia, ¿cierto? Que podría ser más bien lo que tú mencionabas hace un momento, son unos hechos específicos en un momento de la historia y en un país o en una sociedad específica, como ciertos tipos de discriminaciones contra ciertos tipos de personas que existen realmente, ¿cierto? Entonces, a lo que voy es que, digamos, más allá de la discusión del esencialismo o no, sí puede haber dentro de esa idea de buscar una causa común dentro de las luchas políticas y sociales, el espacio para poder buscar cierto tipo de identidad. Aunque, por ejemplo, la identidad de decir somos mujeres y somos feministas es absolutamente reduccionista, porque pues hay muchos tipos de mujeres, muchos tipos de feministas, obviamente, ¿cierto? Pero eso sí puede ayudar a armonizar hasta cierto punto algunas luchas y algunos intereses, sobre todo políticos y sociales, en algunos momentos del tiempo, aunque obviamente todo el tiempo tiene que estar esta discusión que justamente tú estás dando desde la filosofía, desde la historia, desde la academia, obviamente también, de la importancia de mantener siempre en la cabeza esta realidad de que somos de todas formas entidades construidas u objetos construidos social y culturalmente. Entonces quería como llevar un poco el análisis a esas dos dimensiones distintas, ¿no? La dimensión más de la práctica de la política y de la lucha social, y la otra, que fue lo que hiciste ahorita en tu última intervención, o sea, no estoy haciendo nada más sino repetir lo que tú dijiste, y la otra dimensión que me parece muy, muy importante también, que llevamos discutiendo bastante tiempo sobre la construcción social y cultural de esos objetos. Me parece importante como problematizarla desde ese punto de vista, y pues aprovecho teniendo la palabra, pues que quería decir también que ya casi estamos terminando el tiempo del seminario, entonces para que no nos alarguemos demasiado, ya creo que en Francia es casi mañana, ¿cierto? Entonces,
No,
casi
¿qué va?
21
¿Qué
de
va,
abril.
chico? ¿Qué va? No, una cosa sola. Hay una distinción en el marxismo que es muy interesante sobre lo que estaba diciendo. Ay, mi español. Skip to English. Go to English. Which is the difference between, how do you say, classe en soi and classe pour soi. Clase en se o en sí y clase para se o para sí. Es la misma cosa. No es una clase social, no es una cuestión de esencialismo, pero son dos cosas: estar parte de un grupo, como los proletarianos, el proletariato, no sé cómo se dice en español, proletariat, to be part of the working class. This is one thing, which is an objective thing, which is you're working in a factory, or to be a woman, or to be gay, you are part of this group. And then there is this sort of social consciousness, which arises from political struggles or social struggle, this sentiment of belonging to this group. To be a worker doesn't turn you into a left-wing person or revolutionary person. It is just the moment where there is this sentiment of belonging. And this was one step important towards this sort of mechanical Marxism, which was going around in the 1950s, something like that. And this difference, which means that what makes you have the social construction of gender, but in a way, for what makes you a woman is the feminist battle. What turns you, what constructs you as a woman, part of this group, is to be conscious. I know a lot of women who are not conscious of that, who are very happy to live their lives, and they are not rebels at all. Even in the academic world, if you say you are a feminist, some people stare at you saying, how can you be feminist if you're a full professor in Paris 1? You know, you have everything you want. But to be a feminist, to be part of a movement, a social movement, whatever it is is to have this reflexivity towards your social situation. And this is totally on the cultural side, not on the natural side. It's not a question of essence. It's a question of political consciousness. And I use political in a very broad sense of the term, not as who should I vote for, Duque? No, not Duque. Should I vote for, what's the name of this man that I like? You
Fajardo,
know.
you like Fajardo.
No, yeah, Fajardo, and the other one, my
Navarro
friend.
Wolf. Navarro
What?
Wolf. Navarro.
So it's not a matter of who do you vote for. It's just a matter of how do you culturally feel part of a group or don't. So classe en soi and classe pour soi. Clase NC or NC. How would you say that in Spanish? Clase para sí y clase NC.
Clase en sí y per se.
Y per se. Okay, my grammar is terrible in Spanish. It's also in French, don't worry, but in Spanish it's worst. Other questions? It's not you told me that we still have time, no? We have to finish?
Todo depende de nuestro grupo, de nuestro equipo coordinador, de nuestras moderadoras y también obviamente de tu tiempo, Annie. Creo que Nicolás había abierto el micrófono,
They did a great job, the coordinadores. They
sí.
asked genial cuestiones y estaban estupendas.
Así que,
bueno, ¿qué dicen los coordinadores?
Daniela, Mariana y Laura.
Tenemos que ir a trabajar.
Es todo de ustedes.
Pues nosotras teníamos una pregunta más, no sé, Mari, si quieres, y pues también depende de tu tiempo, Annie, claro.
Yo tengo tiempo. Yo no voy a hacer los bares y los lugares para fiestas son cerrados a causa del virus, entonces voy a quedar en mi casa.
Bueno, pues sí, sería pues como una última pregunta y creo que queda mucho con lo que estábamos diciendo ahorita, digamos que esa como construcción cultural que hemos tenido como de la mujer y el hombre y queríamos pues preguntarte tú qué piensas, digamos, como de ciertas carreras o trabajos que se han visto como soft, no sé cómo ponerlo, digamos, derivado del hecho de que las mujeres estén involucradas en eso. Entonces sí queríamos preguntarte, digamos, tú qué piensas de eso y como de la diferenciación que se ha hecho en algunas carreras y en algunas materias, como por el hecho de que las mujeres estén muy involucradas o no tan involucradas.
Again, this is very related to history. In all societies, you had women who were scientists, who were head of religious group, who were in politics. Not many, but you had this. But most of the women, they were kept in so-called women jobs, which were considered as inferior jobs, of course, you know, taking care of the children, taking care of the sick people in hospitals and, you know, basically care. But it's extremely interesting because in France, the women had a right to vote after World War II. And then you had some women who became elected in small communities, not necessarily in a national level, but small community. So at the beginning, even in the governments, women were in charge of education, health, childhood, everything that had to do with their supposed work in the family. Now in France, since 30 years, you have women head of the army, you have women responsible for the agriculture, responsible for industry, responsible for, I mean, there is no specificity. We didn't have a woman president. We had a woman prime minister. So what I'm saying is that there is no, the construction of jobs for women is totally historical. And usually what is interesting is that it is really not only is it historical, but when women arrive in a profession, take judge in France, judges are more and more women. Lawyers are more and more women. Professors for small children are more and more women. And the profession which had a high status in the 19th century is having a less and less good status because it is in a majority occupied by women. And this is definitely a system. I don't know who asked the question before saying the legal things is not enough. Of course it's not enough. I mean, you still have this idea that if a position is as a majority occupied by women, it should be less paid, it should be less respected, it should be less considered than if it is occupied by men. Yeah, of course. I don't know if this was your question, maybe I misunderstood. Was it the question or not? Otherwise you have to reformulate it.
No, yes, it was perfect. Because it was exactly that I think that, en español, mejor. Que pues precisamente, pues también creo que es algo que se ha construido, digamos, absolutamente de manera cultural, como social y política, porque pues digamos que el hecho de ser mujer realmente no constituye que sea, pues que lo que uno está haciendo sea más fácil o que lo que uno está haciendo pues sea distinto a lo que pueda hacer un hombre. Entonces digamos que por eso quería hacer esa pregunta, como en esta discusión que teníamos de cuál es la esencia de ser mujer y que o si es algo cultural y sí, digamos esa era la pregunta, entonces muchas gracias.
I definitely think that culture, I believe in culture over nature, and this is why I'm not essentialist. In other sense, I think that if you take the historical, I already said that, I'm repeating myself, slate maybe. If you take the role of men and women, it has been terribly different in different societies over time. Over time, I say in the last, I don't know, 10,000 years. There are a lot of articles explaining that in some prehistorical societies, you had women hunting, you had women painting in the caves, and women had access to the same professions or activities than men. So all this is definitely a matter of social construction. And our societies are as primitive as the prehistorical societies in that respect. And we have the same racism and the same sexism and the same sort of way of cataloging in a hierarchical order this group of people which would be less something than this other group of people. And of course, women are often on the group which is hierarchically considered as inferior. Even more so maybe maybe in South America because of the tradition of religion. Maybe the machismo is even stronger. I don't know, you have to tell me. I know that in Europe, for instance, it's extremely interesting to see that the Protestant country of the north of Europe are less discriminating regarding women and are more egalitarian regarding the position offered, political position, economical position, whatever, the social position, whatever, culture and all that, than the countries of Southern Europe. Countries of Southern Europe are changing fast, but if you take 30 years ago, you had much more president of the republic, prime minister, ministers, head of big factories, big industries and all that, women in the northern part of Europe. Is it related to what? To climate? That was Montesquieu's theory. I'm not very keen on the theory of the role of climate. Is it related to religion, maybe? Is it related to, what is it related to? to a cultural condition. I mean, social construction or historical construction is always extremely, extremely sophisticated and has multiple facets. But it is true that the relationship between genders is doesn't work. You take Europe, which is a tiny continent, it works extremely differently if you go to Sweden and if you go to Spain. And it's interesting to analyze. At the same time, Spanish women won a lot of battles after Franco because they needed more freedom, they needed more liberty, and they were very active in gaining new rights. So it is changing. But why is it so? Why different societies construct gender relations in a different way? It is an extremely complex question.
Yo creo que podemos tomar, perdón, Nicolás, un momento solamente rápido como para decir que podemos tomar justamente una última pregunta de Nicolás como para que vayamos cerrando. Y solamente un comentario, afortunadamente en los últimos años en Francia no hubo una presidenta mujer porque la única opción que había era Le Pen, entonces eso hubiera sido muy complicado.
No,
pero ya, será el único.
No, you had Ségolène Royal as a candidate. She was defeated. She was a candidate.
Quería preguntar con el entusiasmo con el que hablabas ahorita de las mujeres yendo a la universidad y es un escenario en el que ellas ganan más que los hombres y los hombres tienen que ir a la casa a cuidar a los hijos. Digamos que mi preocupación muchas veces como hombre dentro de todo esto es de todas formas el mundo tremendamente competitivo y violento que ha salido de este deseo masculino, de la racionalidad eurocéntrica en la que se estaría metiendo la mujer en ese momento. Y ahí mi preocupación se va, por ejemplo, en la diferencia de géneros que hay en suicidio en todos los países capitalistas. En Colombia, por ejemplo, creo que es el 80% de los suicidios son hombres y el suicidio es la tercera muerte más común en Colombia y creo que eso pasa, creo que en Francia es como el 70-75. Mi pregunta es, desde esa perspectiva tuya, ¿qué pasaría si no hay esa esencia, si todo es una construcción? Es decir, si no hay esta otra perspectiva de la mujer en ese escenario en el que las mujeres ahora están al mando económico y los hombres en la casa, ¿serían las mujeres las que empezarían a suicidarse?
No tengo ni idea. No, eso es pero los libros de Angus Deaton, bueno, Angus Deaton es muy interesante en muchas cosas, pero su tesis, que no son los hombres, son los hombres pobres blancos, poor white man, y tiene una multitud de explicaciones como la idea que los latinoamericanos, la gente que vienen de Asia, the black people, todos los otros que los WASP, que los blancos americanos, tienen estructuras religiosas o familiares más, how do you say solid? ¿Sólidas se dice? No sé, bueno, más solid. More solid. So they don't have solid family structure. They don't have religious structure, which are social structure. They earn less. They don't have women who earn much less than them. Their wives or their potential wives earn more. And he explained, and there's a lot of setup, and there is this industrialization of the 1950s and 60s and 70s is dying in the United States, which means that their role as proletariat, as worker in a car factory, or this sort of pride that they could have in being a macho, but I'm working, I'm building trucks and all that, has vanished. And there is this extremely interesting culture set of different structure who are crackling down, which explains what Deaton calls suicide, which is not necessarily, you know, bang, you take a pistol and you end your life, but which explains this high rate of death younger than 40 or 50 years ago of this population of the poor white man. And it is extremely interesting. This is why I did put this together with what Chiapori was saying on the fact that women get more and more education and potentially, it's not yet there, but potentially will earn more money. It is an interesting movement in the, I'm not sure because of all this discrimination, the glass ceiling and all that, I'm not sure it will be so easy. But the scheme, the science fiction narrative is rather interesting. Is it difficult, for instance, in Colombia, for you, for the young men who are there, is it more difficult to be a boy or a man today than it was 50 years ago? Or it's much more fun and interesting? I'm asking Nicola, I'm asking...
Like in my own experience, like I am happier than I was 10 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's, I think it's much more fun. It's much more interesting than just to be the macho head of the family. Well, I suppose the men who took this class, this seminar, are biased.
But you, all the time, you also have these like the intersections of oppression, social all the time. For example, when it's funny, when I'm with my friends from philosophy or anthropology, they say I'm too macho and I might be too violent. And when I am with my friends from administration or from finance, they say that I'm too female, that I dance like a girl and that I act like a girl many times. So I'm all the time like in this place where in no place I am fine. Like in no place I am doing what I should be doing.
Are you saying that you don't have an essence?
Yes, I think I am. I think I am. But I'm not sure as well as I've been grown up as a male. I think I am also not in the position of saying that I don't have an essence, because if I eat half an essence, that essence would be given for granted.
It was just una broma.
But I mean, I think that as a male, at the same time, sometimes I can just give for granted the way I gaze the world, because it's the dominant gaze that it's everywhere when I read, when I go to university, when I do research.
What do you study? Do you study economics? At Los Andes. And what about the other boys? Let me see if I can get some names. If I change this. Luis. Who else? Luis, are you here or are you sleeping? You're asleep. Andres. Daniel. They are in pajamas. They're already, they're out. They left the seminar long ago.
Ya no se atreven. Y es que, Annie, digamos, ya pasamos 2 horas y 45. Este es como oficialmente el horario de la clase. Casi nunca nos ha pasado esto, creo. Siempre tenemos alguna pausa o es mucho más corta la sesión. Esto para nuevamente agradecerte. No, todo lo contrario. La discusión estuvo maravillosa, genial como siempre. Muchísimas gracias, Annie, nuevamente por todas tus...
Bueno, gracias a todos, gracias a los organizadores, gracias a Erich, por cierto, y gracias a los otros, aún a los que se fueron hace 2 horas.
Y muchas gracias. Muchas gracias de verdad a todos y todas por las preguntas, por la organización, a Daniela, a Mariana y a Laura, y por las intervenciones, por las preguntas que estuvieron buenísimas. Y Annie, de verdad, muchas gracias por todas las cosas, todas las ideas que nos dejas, las referencias y todas las discusiones súper importantes, muy esenciales sobre lo que tenemos que seguir pensando.
I thought I would speak much more about women in economics. I had this pile of paper ready to give you with details, titles, and all that. But
perfecto, para la próxima, para otra sesión.
Vez.
Ya quedas súper invitada para la próxima vez.
Ok.
Muchas gracias,
bueno,
Annie.
No le puedo decir buenas noches porque aquí no hay más sol, pero buena vida. Mejor.
Buena vida.